The Tower of London, a fortress steeped in history, loomed ominously against the twilight sky. The ancient stones whispered tales of treachery, imprisonment, and bloodshed. For centuries, the tower had been a witness to the darker side of human nature. It was here that Anne Boleyn met her end, where the princes in the tower vanished without a trace, and where countless souls had suffered in the shadow of the executioner's axe. The ghosts of these past lives were said to linger, trapped within the cold walls, waiting for the living to disturb their restless slumber. Oliver Markham, a historian and paranormal investigator, had long been fascinated by the tower's dark history. With a new documentary series in the works, he was granted rare permission to spend a night alone within the tower's confines. Accompanied only by his camera equipment and a few monitoring devices, Oliver was eager to capture the supernatural on film. The air was heavy with the anticipation of uncovering long-buried secrets. As the gates closed behind him, sealing him inside, Oliver felt a chill run down his spine. The silence was palpable, broken only by the distant sounds of the Thames. He set up his base in the White Tower, the central keep, and prepared for a night of exploration. The structure's thick walls seemed to exude an oppressive aura, as if they held back the weight of centuries. With the last rays of the sun fading, Oliver began his journey through the labyrinthine passages. His first stop was the Bloody Tower, infamous for its association with the mysterious disappearance of the young princes. He set up his camera and spoke into it, recounting the history and the theories surrounding the boy's fate. As he narrated, a faint creaking sound echoed through the corridor. Oliver paused, straining to hear. The creak turned into a low, anguished wail. He glanced around, but the corridor was empty. His heart raced. The legends of the tower's hauntings were already proving to be more than mere stories. He continued to explore, documenting the dark history of each location. In the Salt Tower, where tortured souls had once languished, Oliver felt a sudden drop in temperature. His breath formed visible clouds and his skin prickled. He glanced at his thermal camera screen, noticing a cold spot forming in the corner of the room. The spot seemed to grow, spreading towards him. Oliver reached out tentatively, feeling an icy chill in the air. The camera captured the inexplicable phenomenon, but to his frustration, there was no physical manifestation. It was as if the very air was being drained of warmth and life. Hours passed, and the night deepened. Oliver's journey brought him to the Wakefield Tower, once used as a private residence and a place of execution. Here, the atmosphere was suffocating, thick with the weight of past tragedies. As he set up his equipment, Oliver heard a faint murmuring. He turned to see the silhouette of a woman at the far end of the room. Her form was ethereal, shimmering faintly in the dim light. Oliver felt a surge of adrenaline. He focused his camera on the figure, speaking softly into his microphone. "Can you hear me? Can you tell me your name?" The woman turned, her face pale and sorrowful. She seemed to glide towards him, her feet not quite touching the ground. Oliver held his breath as she drew closer, her eyes wide with an expression of pleading. She opened her mouth, and a barely audible whisper escaped her lips. "Help! Him!" Before Oliver could react, the figure dissolved into thin air. The room was silent once more, but the chill remained. Shaken, Oliver reviewed the footage. The camera had captured the ghostly image, but her voice was barely discernible. He replayed the clip, straining to make out her words. Help! Him! Who could she be referring to? The question gnawed at him as he continued his exploration. As the night wore on, Oliver made his way to the Tower Green, the site of many executions, including that of Anne Boleyn. The moonlight cast long shadows, giving the area an eerie, spectral appearance. Here, he felt a heavy sense of dread, as if the ground itself mourned the blood spilled upon it. He set up his camera near the spot where the scaffold once stood and began to record. Suddenly, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew thick with the scent of roses, and Oliver felt a soft breeze despite the stillness of the night. He turned to see a woman dressed in white, her face hidden beneath a veil. She stood where the scaffold had once been, her posture dignified and serene. Oliver's heart pounded. Could this be the ghost of Anne Boleyn? "Anne," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Is that you?" The figure raised her head, revealing a face of haunting beauty. Her eyes, filled with sorrow, met his. She began to speak, her voice clear and melodic, yet tinged with an undercurrent of despair. "They took everything from me. My crown, my husband, my life. And still, I wait." Oliver felt a pang of sympathy. The tragedy of her life was well documented, but to see her ghost, still longing for justice and peace, was profoundly moving. He opened his mouth to speak, but the air around him suddenly grew cold. The scent of roses vanished, replaced by the metallic tang of blood. The woman in white let out a soft gasp, and her image flickered, her serene expression twisted into one of horror. She mouthed a single word, her voice choked with terror: "Beware." With that, the apparition vanished, leaving Oliver alone in the darkness. He felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. Something was wrong. The energy in the air had changed, becoming charged with a palpable menace. He packed up his equipment quickly, feeling an inexplicable urgency to leave. As he made his way back to the White Tower, the corridors seemed to stretch endlessly, twisting and turning in ways they hadn't before. Panic began to set in as Oliver realized he was lost. The walls felt closer, the air heavier. He quickened his pace, heart racing. The sound of footsteps echoed behind him, growing louder and more insistent. He glanced over his shoulder but saw nothing. The footsteps continued, closing in. Oliver broke into a run, desperate to escape the unseen pursuer. He burst into the White Tower, slamming the door behind him. His chest heaved as he struggled to catch his breath. The room was dark, the shadows deepening the sense of dread. He fumbled for his flashlight, his hands shaking. As he turned it on, the beam illuminated the stone walls, revealing a message scrawled in what looked like blood. "Do not wake the dead." A low growl filled the room, vibrating through the floor. Oliver swung the flashlight around, the beam catching a dark figure in the corner. The figure was tall, shrouded in a cloak, its face obscured. The air around it seemed to distort, warping the space. Oliver felt an overwhelming sense of malice emanating from the entity. "Who are you?" Oliver shouted, his voice shaking. The figure stepped forward, and the shadows seemed to cling to it, distorting its form. It reached out a hand, skeletal and twisted. The growl grew louder, turning into a guttural snarl. Oliver backed away, his heart pounding in his chest. The entity continued to advance, its presence suffocating. The room grew colder, the darkness deeper. Suddenly the air was filled with whispers, unintelligible but filled with urgency. The shadows writhed, and Oliver felt a sharp pain in his chest. He gasped, dropping to his knees. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices crying out in pain and despair. The figure loomed over him, and Oliver felt a crushing weight press down on him as if the very air was trying to suffocate him. In a final, desperate act, Oliver reached out, trying to touch the entity. His hand passed through it, the sensation like plunging into ice water. The pain intensified, and the whispers became a deafening roar. Oliver felt himself slipping away, his vision darkening. The last thing he saw was the entity's face, a grotesque mask of shadows and malice. When Oliver's colleagues found him the next morning, he was unconscious, his equipment scattered around him. They rushed him to the hospital, where he remained in a coma for weeks. When he finally awoke, he could barely speak, the events of that night locked away in the darkest corners of his mind. The footage he had captured was reviewed, but much of it was distorted, as if something had interfered with the recordings. The few clear moments showed the apparitions, but the entity that had attacked him was nowhere to be seen. Oliver never returned to the Tower of London. The experience left him shaken, a shadow of the man he once was. The documentary was never completed, and the footage was locked away, a haunting reminder of the dangers that lurk in the shadows of history. The Tower of London continued to stand, a silent sentinel over the city, its dark past entwined with the present. The ghosts remained, waiting for the next curious soul to disturb their restless slumber. The warning scrawled in blood had been clear: do not wake the dead. But the tower's history was filled with those who had dared, and the consequences were always the same: terror, madness, and a brush with the unknown. For some, the allure of the tower's mysteries was too strong to resist. They came, drawn by the tales of hauntings and the promise of glimpsing the supernatural, but the tower kept its secrets closely guarded, and those who ventured too close to the truth often paid a high price. The shadows that clung to the ancient stones were not just the remnants of the past, they were a living, breathing presence, waiting to ensnare the unwary. As for Oliver, he never spoke of his experience. The memories remained a dark, impenetrable fog, only surfacing in his nightmares. The tower had taken something from him that night, something intangible but vital, and though he tried to move on, the scars of that encounter lingered, a constant reminder of the thin veil between the living and the dead.